Robby, please regale us with your radar today.
All right, Brianna. Well, there is no pastime more beloved by Congress than beating up on social media executives. And on Wednesday, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee engaged in yet another round of fact-free histrionics as they thunderously denounced four tech CEOs, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, X's Linda Yaccarino, Snapchat's Evan Spiegel, and Discord's Jason Citron, for a litany of allegedly unsafe business practices. Attending the committee meeting were the parents of several young people who tragically took their own lives after being scammed or bullied on social media. As such, the proceedings felt very much like a trial in which the CEOs, Zuckerberg in particular, stood accused of literal child murder. Now, many of the Senate's anti-tech crusaders and, frankly, main characters were present, including Republican Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Josh Hawley, and Democratic Senators Dick Durbin, Amy Klobuchar, and Richard Blumenthal. Senator Elizabeth Warren wasn't there, though she received several favorable shout-outs from the Republicans. Indeed, both sides of the political aisle were exceedingly pleased with themselves for acting in bipartisan fashion to wildly accuse four business leaders of complicity in despicable crimes against children. Now, if that sounds like an exaggeration, consider that Hawley prompted Zuckerberg to apologize to the families in the audience and then faulted him for refusing to pay them damages from his personal fortune. Have you compensated the victims? Hawley demanded. Take a look.
Senator, our job and what we take seriously is making sure that we build industry-leading tools to find harmful content,
make money,
take it off the services,
to make money,
and to build tools that empower parents.
So you didn't take any action. You didn't take any action. You didn't fire anybody. You haven't compensated a single victim. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. There's families of victims here today. Have you apologized to the victims? Would you like to do so now?
Well,
they're here. You're on national television. Would you like now to apologize to the victims who have been harmed by your product? Show them the pictures. Would you like to apologize for what you've done to these good people?
I'm sorry for everything that you've all been through. It's terrible knowing you have to go through the things that your families have suffered. And this is why we invested so much and are going to continue doing industry-leading efforts to make sure that no one has to go through the types of things that your families have had to suffer.
You know, why, Mr. Zuckerberg, why should your company not be sued for this? Why is it that you can claim, you hide behind a liability shield, you can't be held accountable? Shouldn't you be held accountable personally? Will you take personal responsibility?
Senator, I think I've already answered this.
There are two big problems with the senator's approach: who they see as the villains here and what they see as the solutions. And I want to start with the first part before moving on to the second. So we have to scrutinize exactly the harms being alleged here. The purpose of this hearing was to explore social media platforms' efforts to combat child sexual abuse material, known as CSAM, and online exploitation more generally. Of course, all major social media platforms already prohibit CSAM and do in fact cooperate with law enforcement to identify and remove abusers, as they should. Zuckerberg patiently explained that Facebook has made millions of reports to law enforcement and to child advocacy organizations and uses AI tools to automatically detect and eliminate abuse. Quote, "We take down anything that we think is sexual abuse material," Zuckerberg said at the hearing. The social media platforms represented at the hearing all work tirelessly to eliminate that vile content. Now, what critics are really alleging is that despite these efforts, some users of social media, including underage people, children and teenagers, still fall prey to pernicious behavior from sexual predators, scammers, and bullies. Take the example of Gavin Guffey, whose tragic death was referenced by Lindsey Graham in his opening remarks. At age 17, Guffey fell victim to a sextortion scheme. A con artist tricked Guffey into sending sexual images of himself on Instagram and then demanded compensation in exchange for keeping them private. Guffey tragically eventually killed himself. Now, this is an appalling crime and should be treated as such. In response, the victim's father, Brandon Guffey, a South Carolina state representative, sponsored legislation to strengthen the law as it applies to sexual blackmail of a minor. Predators who engage in fraud, blackmail, and sexual manipulation should absolutely be held accountable for their crimes. They should be brought to justice. But let's be clear here. The perpetrators of this crime is not Mark Zuckerberg or Linda Yaccarino or any other tech executive or Elon Musk if he'd been there. The perpetrator is the person who blackmailed Guffey. Anyone trying to move the accountability spotlight to the platform itself is engaging in blame shifting, I'm sorry to say, in service of an agenda that's pro-regulation and ultimately pro-censorship. More on that in a minute. Now, in other contexts, the fact that Facebook itself is not to blame would be obvious. In 2010, Rutgers University student Tyler Clementi killed himself, you might remember this story, after his roommate secretly recorded him having sex with another male student. Now, this became a big national story, understandably, and the roommate, Robby, was prosecuted and convicted for invasion of privacy and some other offenses. But nobody thought the webcam company was at fault. And in fact, many Republicans intuitively understand this principle when it comes to other subjects. Indeed, the GOP generally takes the position that if one person shoots another person, the victim ought not to sue the gun manufacturer. In fact, gun industry enjoys major liability shields from exactly that thing. Guns don't kill people, people do. That's a common maxim of Second Amendment supporters. And in my view, they're right. I agree with them. But when it comes to social media, where the extent of the harm to young people is not in any way meaningfully settled, and in fact routinely exaggerated, many Republicans are marching in lockstep with their Democratic colleagues. At the hearing, Graham echoed the exact rhetoric of Democrats accusing Zuckerberg and the others of having, quote, blood on your hands. Of course, Graham is far from the first political figure to make this claim. In July 2021, remember, President Joe Biden accused Zuckerberg of literally killing people because Facebook and Instagram had not done more to purge content that was critical of COVID mandates. That's the broader agenda of both the Democratic and Republican parties, greater government control over social media content. In order to obtain this control, senators from both parties have sponsored legislation to repeal or reform Section 230, the federal statute that protects internet companies from some liability. Now, Section 230 was a frequent punching bag at the Wednesday hearing. Quote, for the past 30 years, Section 230 has largely remained unchanged, allowing big tech to grow into the most profitable industry in the history of capitalism without fear of liability for unsafe practices. That was a quote from Durbin at the hearing. That has to change, he said. Graham was even more explicit, calling on Congress to repeal Section 230 altogether. Now, in the past, former President Donald Trump, Biden, Warren, Klobuchar, Cruz, Hawley, and on, many other major political figures, they've all said similar things. But without Section 230, free speech on social media would be fundamentally threatened. It would be over. The reason the platforms permit users to post content at will is Section 230, which does establish that the content in question is the responsibility of the user rather than the platform. Think about it. If Facebook, Instagram, X were liable for all the content that appeared in their feeds, every post, every tweet, they'd have to vet it much more carefully. For one thing, this would dramatically increase the need for the platforms to engage in content moderation to protect themselves from libel lawsuits. Does Graham really want that? Does Donald Trump? On the contrary, complaining that social media companies engage in too much moderation is a standard conservative talking point. And there's merit to it. Again, I agree with them. As revealed by independent investigations like Matt Taibbi's Twitter files and my own Facebook files, those platforms censored contrarian content about elections and COVID-19 at the federal government's behest. Republicans were rightly outraged. Killing or even limiting Section 230 plays directly into the hands of the would-be censors. Suffice it to say that we should certainly have compassion for people who are victimized on social media, of course. And we should continue to explore methods of detoxifying the platforms, making them safer for kids. But the agenda of the Senate Judiciary Committee is not the protection of children. It's greater control over dissident speech. Don't fall for it.
I think that's exactly right. I broadly agree with your analogy, and certainly the implications of what would happen if people were liable for anything that was put on anybody's feed, which is why Section 230 is so important and why threats over removing it should be paid very close attention to by all of those who are interested in being able to use these social media platforms, which have been so instrumental at various political moments, including the current one, to continue to be free.
For us, for the kind of content we produce. I mean, it's and we think it's value. We think alternative perspectives are important, and we rely on this infrastructure to do it. Yeah,
I remember we were in the tort class that I took in law school. We had this conversation about how the law is structured in a liability context, and whether or not you want to actually create higher liability standards for certain people in certain instances, and why would you do that and where. And as we were talking it through, it emerged what the lesson that we were being taught Socratically was that there are circumstances where you want liability to attach to the person who has the most control in the situation to prevent the harm. In the scenario that you described with the college student who filmed their other fellow student having gay sex and then they committed suicide, the idea that the camera company, the streaming company would have any ability to discern the kind of content that was being recorded on their device and could do that in a way that didn't undermine the purpose and utility of the device itself, it's unfathomable. But if we're talking about, say, a rail line company that has control of its own tracks, has control of having maintenance over the tracks, picking what kind of brakes are used in the train, all of those kinds of things, then we might say, well, I'm going to say there's a stricter liability standard for them, especially if they're hauling dangerous cargo, than a farmer whose tree might have fallen over the tracks and doesn't have it anywhere near the ability to monitor and keep the environment safe. And in this instance, it's just really hard to understand how anyone could imagine that in the instance of interpersonal bullying, the company has more of an ability to intervene when what we're really just saying is the kind of horrible things that people do to each other and have always done to each other in the world simply because they're happening on a social media platform needs to extend liability to folks that really aren't in the position of control here. It's very misguided, and I think you're completely right when you say it's just a proxy attack on free speech.
That's exactly that. The hearing was really remarkable. It wasn't just Holly, it was all of them were just thunderously angry at Zuckerberg and the others. And I understand the pain of the families. I can't even imagine that. It's so horrible. And I would absolutely want, again, the person directly responsible to face the harshest possible penalty. You want to talk about strengthening those penalties, having more penalties for swatting people, for using the internet for criminal activity, but it's because the underlying activity of that person is criminal. And we can talk about dealing with that, but this is such a misdirected effort.
If it were that, Facebook had a policy that didn't allow folks who were, if someone's harassing you and you block them and they keep making new accounts and they're able to keep finding you and there's some technological intervention that's feasible, possible, maybe even exists, but Facebook doesn't implement it, that's a different kind of a question, right? Then it's in violation of its own policies. But this?
Right, if they because they have sloppy security and they leak your data or your location to someone who then kills you, or if they did get sued when they misrepresented how well video was doing on the platform, and a lot of media organizations pivoted to video, and that was untrue, and they got sued and they had to pay out. So it's not that they can't be sued, it's that this is blame shifting. Again, as I said, in service of the broader agenda, which is the U.S. government wants more control over what we can say. All right, we have Brianna's Radar up next. Stay tuned. More Rising in just a minute.